Hi everybody, I hope you're having a great afternoon. Thank you and welcome to this edition of Race on Main Street. We have a great show for you today. I'm your host, Scott Race. In a little while we'll bring out Don Solomon from Solomon Associates to talk a little bit about marital law. But before we get started, I need to introduce my co-host and partner at Simon Capital Management, and I guess most importantly my brother, Stuart Race. Stuart, how are you? It's a great fall afternoon in Philadelphia. How are things going today?
Things are going great, and as I've said so many times before, there is just no place on earth I'd rather be than here right now.
I don't disagree with that.
It's going to be a great show.
Yeah, it's going to be a great show. Thanks for joining us. So, as always, we usually sort of get started with the idea of talking a little bit about business in the, really how it's affecting Main Street America, middle class America, to kind of kick us off. So I know that there's been an awful lot about Volkswagen over the last few days, few weeks.
We are going to talk about Volkswagen today.
Yeah, and I know you've looked into this quite a bit. So
I have.
What are some of the things that you've come up with? It's pretty incredible, actually.
Well, interestingly, Volkswagen today has announced that there's going to be a second wave of emissions problems. So the first wave, as you may know, dealt with their model years 2009 to 2015. These are 2016s now that they're having a similar problem with. Now the 2009s to 2015s, they had a software module in there that allowed them to do better on emissions tests than they should have.
So they figured out a way to cheat on the test.
But it doesn't, right. But in fact, if the thing did what it did during the test at all times, it would be great.
So why?
But it only does it during the test. So the 2016s now, the thing is that I'm not a car guy.
Right.
But apparently.
So it's a 2016, so it's like the models that are just hitting the lots right now.
Correct. And what these cars do is they have a software module in them. It's also a software situation where apparently nitrous oxide is bad for the environment.
Right.
But the two things that make it up, nitrogen and oxygen, separately are fine. That's what we breathe.
Right.
So apparently what this thing does is it creates a situation where the nitrous oxide breaks down to nitrogen and oxygen faster and more efficiently than it does on the road. It only does that in the test.
Right. So for a short period of time, it separates while they're doing the test very quickly, and then it registers a better emissions test.
Correct. And then when it's not in the test, it doesn't do this. Okay. So it knows when it's, I guess, based on some code that's typed in.
Sure.
So the point is, with the first problem, Volkswagen had said, hey, back in 2008, we had a bunch of rogue software engineers that weren't doing what they were supposed to be doing, and that's what happened. But now it's, again, in 2016, it looks like it might be more of a company-wide initiative,
right?
As opposed to something that just happened because it was off the beaten trail.
Right.
But here's the thing, we always talk about Main Street America. We always talk about how this affects middle-class people. I have a couple of statistics, and I don't want to get them wrong, so I'm going to just check my notes here. But essentially, what we're talking about is Volkswagen, as you know, is the world's largest car maker.
Yes.
Okay. Now, last year, Volkswagen sold nearly 400,000 cars in the U.S.
In the U.S. alone.
In the U.S. alone.
That's not around the world. That's just here domestically.
That is correct. So in terms of a middle-class effect, we're talking about 20 plants that exist, 20 Volkswagen plants that exist in this all throughout the country. California, Nebraska.
That employs a lot of people in the United States. It's got to.
Of course it does. Each one of those plants has an effect on something like 13,000 jobs in and around the plant. So whether it's a vendor relationship, a car dealer, or the guy who actually works at the plant, each one of those plants has 13,000 jobs it affects times 20 plants. Wow. That's 250,000 jobs. And Volkswagen announced today that there are going to be massive layoffs next year. All right? Now, what's the economic effect? All right? Each one of those plants accounts for approximately $12 billion with a B dollars in economic benefits.
So $12 billion
per plant
times the 20 plants times its effect on Main Street
You're talking
America.
about $250 billion.
Right.
Dollars.
That's like more than many countries. what they bring in as a country.
I don't have that.
Economics for the year.
You're right. It's got to be. I mean, there's 190 countries out there. It's got to be more than half of them.
Right.
If not, go ahead.
No, what I was going to say is maybe somebody would take the time out there to maybe take a look and send a note to us.
We could use
regarding what might be out there and what might not be out there.
We could certainly use all the help we can get. Absolutely.
Yeah. So the point is that there's a lot of zeros after that first number, and that obviously translates to major impact around the country, really around the globe, but around the country that we're looking at in terms of Main Street middle class America.
Sure, because just the jobs themselves and the economic analysis, the economic downriver that comes off of that situation has got to be affected. So, the message that we're trying to put out there for Main Street is you may not drive a Volkswagen.
Right.
Okay. But it's important that we sort of all keep our eyes on the prize in the sense that stuff like this is going on, and we're not looking to paint, we're not reporting anything other than what's been out there in the news media with regard to Volkswagen or anybody else. Hopefully what will happen is that if there's a deleterious effect with regard to Volkswagen, because one of my other statistics that I want to get out there is that there's something like 150,000 Volkswagens that cannot be delivered now to the dealers.
So you mean they're just like sort of sitting at the loading dock,
or in the ports, or if they were built here in America, they're sitting on the factory,
right?
And they're not. So dealers aren't going to be able to replace inventory,
right?
And the layoffs then are not just going to be Volkswagen corporate, but they're going to be on Main Street.
Yeah.
So,
look at all the lending sources that
correct.
go into it, the tire companies that manufacture maybe away from the plant that are affected, all the nuts and bolts that go into fixing a
Absolutely.
car, all those things. That's pretty impactful.
It is, and the point is that we're also not trying to, it's not our business here. It's not what we do here to try to be negative with regard to the effect that these things are going to have on Main Street. But what people need to realize is that it may take a little bit of time to pick up the slack in the economy because of this. So, maybe people will buy more Fords next year or something like that.
Yeah, I mean, that's what tends to happen. So the rippling effect, one gets squashed a little bit, one pumps up a little bit, and people make a jump from working at this plant versus that plant. But again, you're right, it's not a quick turnaround because it's such a large number. Right. So you're right, keep the eye on the prize and keep plowing forward regardless of it. Hopefully they'll be able to work this out quickly. I think that's the plan.
I hope so.
And I wouldn't be surprised if you actually saw fewer layoffs. I think that sometimes they're using that to leverage this to move the process along quicker.
That's true, and hopefully that'll be the case.
Yeah,
and,
hopefully it will. Hopefully
we're going to have, it'll be an ongoing type of situation that we'll certainly keep our eye on with regard to Main Street. So we're going to shift over to our guest.
Yeah, and I have, interestingly enough, our guest, Don Solomon from Solomon & Associates. He's a longtime friend and a longtime colleague.
We've known Don a long time.
Yeah, so as have I. Not as long, but certainly long. I actually have an interesting story, actually about my wife, Joanne. I don't have to introduce her to you,
my sister-in-law.
Your sister-in-law, Joanne.
Who I love very much.
Yeah, so Joanne and I have been married, as you know, almost 17 years, November. And we got married in Jamaica.
I remember.
Yep. So a whole bunch of us went down to Jamaica. We stayed for a while.
We did.
And everything was fine. Everybody then left. We had our honeymoon there, came home, new married couple, bought a house, all that kind of stuff.
Yes.
Maybe 5 years in, it was from 98 to 2002, I think it was. Joanne worked at HUP, and I get her benefits are changing. It's like October. It's like benefit season. So I'm reading through the benefits, and you're laughing because you know.
Benefit season struck me as funny because it is benefit. You're right.
Yeah, so it's benefit season, and I'm reading through, and I start to think to myself, I'm not sure if I'm actually married at this point. And it's been like 5 years. So I'm reading through.
Married in the United States. You're married in Jamaica.
I don't know where I'm married, if I'm married at all. So I read through the material, and now I'm a little bit concerned because I'm concerned that maybe they're going to cut us off from her benefits,
right.
which are important. So I called you and I said, hey, look, I got some interesting news. I think I might not be married because of the chain of events around
I think the first thing I said was, don't tell mom.
That sounds like
Let's
would be
see
a
if we
good
can fix
response.
this without
Right.
telling mom.
So, but you had actually said, hey, why don't you give Don a call? He'll have the information for you and be able to sort it out. And fortunately we were, and as Don will probably chime in a little bit in a second about this, there were no issues related to the marriage.
You were actually married.
We were actually married. There was no doubt about it, and all was good. So.
And all was good. And all remains good.
And all remains good.
There you
That's
go.
correct.
So let's turn to this week's guest. As I indicated at the top of the show, our guest is Don Solomon. He is a practicing attorney and has been a practicing attorney in the Delaware Valley for almost 25 years. He's a Philadelphia guy, having graduated from Cheltenham High, and after graduating from high school, went to Albright College in Reading. Go Lions. And he attended law school in Washington, D.C. at the American University Law School. After that, he returned to the city, practiced in Philadelphia for a bunch of years before starting his own practice up in Hatboro, Montgomery County. Don specializes in the areas of matrimonial, estate, and real estate law, and he's here with us today. So, Don, welcome.
Thanks for having me, guys. I appreciate it.
Yeah, thanks for being here. Maybe you remember that phone call a while back.
It's been a while. Since then, fortunately, I've had a lot of other calls.
I would imagine so. So with the idea of some of the aspects of law that you practice, we'll get into in a little while. It's interesting with so many attorneys here right in Philadelphia where we are right now, where we all sort of live or in the surrounding area. Why Hatboro? Why did you choose to move out of the city into a more suburban area?
Well, let me start with the fact that I opened my own office. Now it's been 20 years. So I've been in Hatboro for quite some time. And when I made the decision to leave Philadelphia to open on my own, I realized for me, what made me special and kind of set me apart was I love to deal with people. And to be in a town like Hatboro was a unique opportunity because Hatboro is a kind of place where they want to take care of their own. When they need paint, they don't go to Home Depot, they go to the paint guy on Main Street in Hatboro. They look to Main Street to be their source for as much as they possibly can. So it was a good opportunity for me to become a professional in that community and also for the community to come take care of me as much as I was going to take care of them. So it was a real strong symbiotic relationship for what I was looking for.
That's great. That's interesting. You talk about Main Street, so that's right on
Well,
par.
I know it's in this title, so I was fully prepared to consider that
Working
was
that
an
in.
important aspect of this discussion.
Yeah,
Thanks.
Thank you.
Is it Main Street in Hatboro? Because
Well-
I'm from media, so it's State Street in media. But
Well, it's funny. The main street in Hatboro is called York Road, which is where my office is located. But there is a Main Street program that has been part of the Pennsylvania community for quite some time. And the Main Street facility opened in Hatboro and then started to source itself through government funding. And they started doing a lot of activities to try to encourage the community to support Main Street communities.
It's interesting.
So you see that that's happened. It's not just in Hatboro. You see in Ambler, they've made a huge development in the last 10 years. You've seen it in Manayunk and Philadelphia areas. It's now, passing all around in the different areas around the state.
well, there's a pitch for Main Street.
Yeah, so it's like small town, sort of right outside the big town, so to speak.
That's right.
Yeah. So when you look at yourself as an attorney in Hatboro, or even I'm sure you have clients that pass through from some of the other counties, Philadelphia, wherever. What defines you? What separates you from the guy down the street? What's your focus? What's your area where you say, hey, that's Don's area?
Well, first of all, by giving back to the community, I find, like I'm in the chamber, I work with Rotary, I'm with the YMCA. I find that most of the business community in Hatboro goes out of their way to try to refer within the business community. So I get in touch with a lot of people. But what people have found and reported back to me is it's so unusual to call a lawyer's office and actually get to speak to a lawyer. And to speak to the same person about the same issue 3 weeks later and have them remember who you are and remember what you talked about, it just doesn't happen. And so it's very important to me that I maintain that direct communication level with my clients. They know they can reach me, I know I can reach them. There's very few people who are in between that traffic. And so that in itself sets things apart. But beyond that, I think what I have also found to be very important is I try to treat people the way I would hope to be treated. You know, you have to remember when people are coming to see me, and the majority of my practice is matrimonial, you're seeing people at their utmost stressful moments. Let's just put it that way. They're overwhelmed, they're emotional, and they're having a hard time. And when you at least understand what they're going through, and I try to place myself in their shoes, I think that gives people a certain confidence level. So I find that's made a really big difference in the way I communicate with my clientele.
Yeah, I'm sure it has. Yeah,
terrific.
And what you've said is interesting because having dealt with attorneys in my professional life, and
What are you looking at me for?
Well, you're an attorney.
I am an attorney.
There's very often there are. You're right. There are barriers.
I answer the phone in my office.
Well, you know.
When
that's
you call.
Well, right. It's a little bit
I
different.
know.
So to have that sort of hand-holding type program in a circumstance that is so tough at that moment for many of your clientele, I think that's probably certainly a worthwhile piece of information and certainly helpful to those people who cross through the door, I'm sure.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So let's talk about matrimonial law.
Sure.
You know, because again, you hear about these, you know, these billionaires that get divorced 8 and 10 times. I don't think that that's really the circumstance on Main Street. Let's get right into it. Let's talk about fault divorce, like fault, no fault. You hear these
Okay.
terms.
Yeah, I mean, people throw out words all the time and they really have no idea what they're talking about. But up until 1980, in this state, there was only one type of divorce, and it was called fault. And that's where you blamed your spouse for the marriage ending. And it was an incredibly complex, expensive, emotional way to get divorced. People had to go into court, bring in all kinds of evidence, whether it was private investigators catching people in hotel rooms or looking at credit card statements to prove that your spouse did something. And you'd not only have to prove that they did something wrong, you'd have to prove that you were an innocent and injured spouse and didn't do something also. And if you couldn't do it, you were stuck together. So you found people leaving the state to get divorced in other states, even other countries, or somebody would come into court and all but say, "Judge, I am the problem. Make it about me," and it's over. And so finally in 1980, Pennsylvania's government kind of woke up and they adopted an option called no fault. And no fault is really the opportunity to say, look, we had a voluntary choice to get married. Why can't we have the same voluntary choice to end this marriage without having to call each other names or do anything? And when it became available, it took over. At this point, I could honestly say probably 99% of every divorce completed in this state is a no-fault divorce. And that's not to say people couldn't go about proving fault. It's just there's almost no benefit to doing so. The only basis to doing it is either to embarrass your spouse, or you have a lot of money that you just want to throw in the garbage, or something equivalent, because there's no significance to it. It doesn't change your rights to distribution of assets. It's not going to change custody. If your spouse is doing something so bad, you can still raise that in your custody fight. You don't have to make that the basis for a divorce. So divorce has gotten a lot simpler. And you've seen it now spread to almost every state in the union. I think New Jersey was one of the last to finally adopt it within the last 5 years. But pretty much everywhere else, this is the way it's done.
So that
and
was
it's
like
the only way.
Back in the day, you would hear they have to go to Reno. You don't have to go to Reno anymore.
No, you're not going back to Jamaica to end your marriage if that's what's going to go on. You can stay right here
Yeah.
in the Pennsylvania.
Although I think there was a
community.
vacation in the interim in Jamaica that almost did. And, anyway,
Well, that's
Yeah,
another story.
That's a whole
another
other
story
thing.
another time. The day that we spent in Jamaica.
The day, right.
Yeah, so not even a full day. But so when it comes to this type of divorce, it almost sounds like in a lot of ways you could maybe almost like arbitrate the divorce just as a person sitting in between two people. Is that something?
You know,
that
it's
ever
funny
happened?
when people talk about mediation, and that's kind of the word that people throw around. Mediation is a tool to try to resolve claims within your divorce.
Okay.
But when people, in my opinion, use mediators to actually process their divorce, they're putting themselves in a little bit of risk. Because for the most part, in my opinion, mediators can't give advice, because if they start giving advice, then they're ethically going to tie themselves to somebody's issue. So they're stuck. So when you see mediators best used, it's often when the litigants come even maybe with attorneys to say to the mediator, can you help us resolve this claim or this issue? When lawyers try to take that role themselves and sit in the middle and say, this is what I think you should do, that's when lawyers are sued for malpractice in divorce law.
So it's not such a good idea,
No,
is what you're
it's
saying.
probably the biggest form of malpractice among attorneys is lawyers who try to put themselves over the line and give advice to both parties. It just really can't be done because unfortunately or fortunately, when you're talking about ending a marriage, people have different interests. But certainly a lawyer can give general opinions of what's to go on and what to expect. But at the end of the day, people need their own counsel to make sure they're not going to be pushed in the wrong direction.
Right. And
It's
so,
really tough.
yeah, I would imagine it would be. It certainly sounds like it's, look, I mean,
Not something
we all
I
know
like.
folks who have been divorced,
Sure.
and it's a tough spot, even when it ends on somewhat of a friendly basis, I guess you could call it.
I mean, taking that one extra step, in some ways, your lawyer is going to control the aspect of how your case ends. When you have the type of lawyer, and lawyers have reputations in this type of matrimonial practice, there are those who litigate everything. Everything is a battle, everything is a fight. And you know what? You're going to pay for that fight. And there's those attorneys who are willing to actually resolve things by agreement. And you really have to go out of your way to interview your lawyer, find out what his reputation or her reputation is like, get a sense of what's going on out there. Look, I can have the biggest fight if I need to, but I don't want to.
Right.
When we get back to
Because it's just
this,
more expensive.
right,
And-
we're talking about Main Street. In my community in Hapro, you're talking about upper blue collar, lower white collar people. They have homes, they have retirement accounts, they're saving for college. They don't want to spend $50,000 to $100,000 on a divorce. So if they get that shark attorney who has that reputation that's going to be a war mentality, they're going to pay for that war mentality and they can't afford it and they don't want to afford it.
And I guess that goes back to what you said about changing the rules in 1980 makes a lot of sense because I would imagine, especially for Main Street America, where dollars count, that probably substantially cut the cost of ending a marriage as opposed to having to prove fault, as opposed to the other side to it.
In fact, lawyers use fault as a threat to scare people. And if you as a person receive pieces of paper that in essence call you names and a bad person, because that's really what fault is doing, you get upset. If you get upset, you're not going to resolve things. Some lawyers are using that. They don't tell their own client that, look, we're going to put in this fault ground, because they'll tell them, we're doing it to try to get you a better deal. But in the back of their mind, maybe they're the kind of war mentality attorney who just wants to make the other side upset.
And the better deal is getting eaten up in fees and going to hearings and
For
things
sure.
like that.
Truly, the only one who's going to benefit is the attorney who's blowing that thing up, turning it into something it need not have been to begin with.
So you mentioned, you touched on, clients really need to be diligent then. Can you give us a sense of, like, for a client, what would be a good road of questions? Like, how do you expose whether the attorney is a guy who wants to mediate or a guy who wants to go to war?
Well, I mean, look, like I said, attorneys have reputations.
Mm-hmm.
Talking to people is your best answer. But when you sit and you interview your attorney and you say, how do we go about resolving this thing? Or, and they only talk about going to trial as opposed to, are we going to have a four-way meeting with my spouse and his or her attorney? That's a good sign that your attorney is the kind who just wants to litigate or is actually willing to try to work through things. You should always try the easy way. Look, again, we're talking about issues. If people are getting divorced without children, at the end of the day, they shake hands, they can walk away. They're like partners. Mm-hmm. But when there's children, at the end of the day, the lawyers may leave, but mom and dad are still mom and dad. You're with each other for the rest of your lives, whether you like them or not. And so you don't want to turn everything into a war. And you need a lawyer who recognizes your children and your life is much more than this 6 months or 2 years of a litigation.
Yeah, that's true. So regardless of the circumstance, in that situation, they're going to be attached. You're right. That's not going away. And they need to be able to work this out in a way where they're going to be able to move forward at some point because they have that common link. And that's obviously I would imagine for most folks, the most important component to it is making sure that whatever goes on can be handled so the kids they're doing the best they can with it, short term and then certainly long term.
Look, your kids are going to grow up, they're going to get married. You both want to be at that ceremony. You both want to be able to be in the same room for your grandchildren to be born. You need to find a lawyer who's not going to make that hard on you.
Yeah,
And that's part of the listening mentality of this whole process. You have to listen to your clients and have a lawyer who listens to you. Remember, at the end of the day, your lawyer is your voice to the system. And if the lawyer is becoming your voice and telling you what your voice should be, you don't have the right lawyer. Your lawyer is supposed to hear you and reflect your goals. Now, sure, a lawyer gives advice, we give recommendations, but at the end of the day, your choice, your life, your budget, your children, and keep control of what's going on. And that's really, really important. And I think people lose that. Yeah. They're so ready to hire, quote, the guy with the biggest reputation that they don't realize the reason they have a big reputation is they're in court all the time wasting people's money.
So you have to keep that in mind. Well, if you're out there and you have any interest in terms of information related here, or you need some additional advice, you can always take a look at hatboroughLaw.com. You'll be able to get some information about Don and Don Solomon and Associates if there's a need.
It's just under Don Solomon Law Office.
Don Solomon Law
I'm sorry.
Office. Okay,
it's fine.
Easy enough.
My research. I have to fire my intern now.
So then,
it is what it is.
With that, last week we talked a little bit about the Museum of Art, and I wanted to touch back on that. We made a quick thought as to, I had met with the CFO at one point, and he had mentioned that the Philadelphia Museum of Art actually, while it's a great cultural institution, the economic impact is pretty substantial, and that it brought in more money than all of the Philadelphia sports teams combined. So I started to think about that a little bit. We're going to finish up with that. And I thought about some of the items related to the sports teams, and for whatever reason I thought about the sale of hot dogs. And I thought, wow, how many hot dogs?
Well, I don't want to out you, but earlier you told me that it was Jake.
Well,
I asked you about hot dogs. Give credit where credit is due.
All right, so my 8-year-old son had said something about the hot dogs related to the sports team, and that's what really brought this on. So I thought about, hey, what's the impact of one single item like that throughout the region? I bet it's pretty incredible. Think about all the hot dogs that are sold, all the buns that go with the hot dogs, ketchup, mustard, relish, all the people who are involved, and what the financial impact is of something as simple as a hot dog at the sporting events, and what the impact is around the area. And it was funny because you thought something interesting about the Phillies as well.
Oh yeah, I just wanted to remind everyone, out there that 5 years ago this month, Roy Halladay threw the no-hitter against the Reds, and although our winter will probably be long and cold, there's always hope for next year. So let's look forward to that. And speaking of next week, our guest on Race on Main Street is going to be Helene Rubin. Helene is the Executive Vice President of Bartash Inc., a Philadelphia printer, and she's going to have a lot to say about the printing industry and how it fits into Main Street here in the region and across the country. So that's something to look forward to.
That sounds great. Well, thank you all for watching. We appreciate it. We'll see you next week. Have a great week on Main Street, and we'll see you soon. Thanks.